All right, let's get into it. We're about to dive into a conflict that, on the surface, was about fish. But really, it was this decades-long fight for identity, for rights, and for the very survival of a people. And it all centers on the incredible life of one man. So picture this. It's a dark winter night, 1945, on the Nisqually River in Washington state. A game warden yells out, "You're under arrest." And the person he's yelling at? A 14-year-old kid who's just checking his family's fishing nets. And that kid yells back these simple, powerful words before they haul him off. That kid was Billy Frank Jr., a member of the Nisqually Nation. And his arrest that night? You could say it was one of the first shots fired in what would become known as the Fish Wars, a battle for the very soul of the Pacific Northwest. And get this, that arrest was not a one-off thing. It was just the first of more than 50 times Billy Frank Jr. would be put in handcuffs for doing what his people had done for thousands of years, fishing. This wasn't some crime spree, this was a lifelong protest. Now, to really understand why he and so many others were willing to get arrested over and over, we've got to zoom out from that riverbank, because this fight was about something much bigger than salmon. It was about a core idea for Native peoples, food sovereignty. It's this fundamental concept that the food you eat, it defines who you are. So, what it all boils down to is this. Food sovereignty is a form of self-governance. It's the right to access and use the traditional foods that have been the foundation of your culture, your health, and your community since the very beginning. It's that basic. And you can see just how deeply food was woven into life. You know, before colonization, native calendars revolved around nature's pantry. For the Algonquin, June was literally the strawberry moon. For the Shawnee, September was the pawpaw moon. And for so many nations, life itself was sustained by what they called the Three Sisters. So what are the Three Sisters? Well, it's corn, beans, and squash. And the genius is that they grow better together like a family. Each plant helps the others out. You can think of them as the exact opposite of, those two sworn enemies, orange juice and toothpaste. It's just a perfect system. But that perfect system, it was deliberately dismantled. Colonization wasn't just about taking land. It was a systematic, calculated effort to separate native peoples from the very foods that define them. And it happened in some pretty devastating ways. Just look at the sheer scale of this disconnection. It's staggering. In a little over 300 years, native nations lost 99% of the lands where they had hunted, fished, gathered, and farmed for millennia. I mean, that's not just losing territory, that's like losing your kitchen, your grocery store, and your pharmacy all at the same time. And this was done through a whole toolbox of strategies. People were forcibly removed from their lands. At federal boarding schools, native kids were literally punished for eating their own cultural foods. You had settlers exploiting resources like timber and fish at a crazy, unsustainable rate. But sometimes the strategy was, well, even more direct. This quote from a U.S. Army colonel, it's just chilling. It lays out an explicit government policy. For Plains tribes like the Great Sioux, who called themselves the Buffalo Nation, the buffalo was everything. And the U.S. government knew that if they annihilated the herds, they could starve tribes into submission and force them to sign away their lands. Which brings us right back to Billy Frank Jr. and the salmon people of the Pacific Northwest. This long, painful history of being disconnected from your food. That's the backdrop for the act of resistance that finally boiled over into the Fish Wars. So here was the central conflict, right? On one hand, you had treaties signed in the 19th century where tribes gave up millions of acres of land but specifically kept their right to fish. That was federal law. But then, by the 20th century, the state of Washington started making its own laws that criminalized native fishing, all under the guise of conservation. And this is where the hypocrisy just becomes so clear. State law enforcement wasn't going after the big commercial boats offshore that were taking over 95% of the salmon. Nope, they were almost exclusively targeting native fishers on the riverbanks who were catching less than 5% of the fish. So what do? Well, the native activists turned to non-violent civil disobedience. Starting in the 1960s, they organized these fish-ins. They would intentionally and very publicly break these unjust state laws to assert their treaty rights. This got nationwide attention and even drew support from big names like Marlon Brando. And Billy Frank Jr. was right there at the heart of it all. He said this once, and it just perfectly captures his role in the movement. He wasn't in some back room making policy. He was on the front lines, on the riverbank, using his own freedom as a tool for justice. He was, in his own words, the getting arrested guy. So after decades of protests, of harassment, of arrests, the fight finally moves from the riverbank into the courtroom. And this incredible story of resistance leads to a landmark victory. It also shines a light on other powerful stories of Native resilience through food. And in 1974, it finally happened. A federal judge handed down a landmark ruling known as the Boldt Decision. This was the moment that vindicated decades of struggle and completely changed the course of history in Washington state. The decision was huge, a total game changer. First, it upheld those old 19th century treaties saying, "Yup, these are the law of the land." And second, it declared that the tribes were entitled to half of all the harvestable fish and had to be treated as co-managers of the fisheries right alongside the state. It was a massive win for sovereignty. And you can see that same spirit of resilience in the really complicated story of fry bread. For many, its origins go back to the traumatic forced removal of the Navajo people, when government rations of flour, sugar, and lard were all people had to survive. So it's a reminder of that pain. But for so many others, it's also become a symbol of comfort and survival, of, making something out of nothing to feed everybody. And that resilience is absolutely alive and well today. All across the country, you have these vibrant food sovereignty movements. The Cherokee Nation is sharing heirloom seeds from its seed bank, universities are studying the genius of the Three Sisters, and amazing Indigenous chefs like Mariah Gladstone are bringing traditional foods back into the spotlight. So this whole story really brings us full circle, doesn't it? The fight of the past, waged by people like Billy Frank Jr., it laid all the groundwork for this ongoing, crucial work of nourishing the future. And what happened to Billy Frank Jr.? Well, the getting arrested guy became a revered statesman. He spent the rest of his life working to protect those treaty rights and to save salmon habitats. The state of Washington now co-manages the river with the tribes. And a year after he passed away, he was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So, in the end, this entire story, from that 14-year-old on a riverbank to a landmark court decision, it really asks all of us to think about this one powerful question. It shows us that nourishing a community's future is about so much more than what's on the plate. It's about culture, it's about rights, and ultimately, it's about the ability to simply exist.